In this episode, I'll talk about when an awakening, or as some call it a breakout of the matrix, most often occurs. What is an awakening? Technically speaking, awakening is letting go of false beliefs about the world you live in. Awakening is noticing the world as it is, not as it should be or as it appears to be. The problem is that awakening very rarely happens when all aspects of your life are pleasant. You know from the previous episode that if things are pleasant, you don't look for unhappiness and aggravation of your situation. You just want to persist in those pleasant circumstances. That's just the way it is. The first necessary condition is to notice that reality is not what we thought it was. The immediate cause that most often draws someone's attention is suffering, and I mean suffering. Not mild discomfort, but suffering, not physical pain that comes from inside you. Very unpleasant and very intense. It is impossible not to notice it. Once you notice your suffering, you can start using your conscious mind to analyze the situation you are in. Here there is some risk. If you start analyzing a situation but have incomplete information, you may come to false conclusions. Therefore, if you even conclude, make sure that the information on which you concluded is true, and check that the conclusion you came to is also true. Test your hypothesis. Do you think that you are not being tested? And what else but testing is shit tests on the part of women. So once you come to the conclusions you've tested to be true, you'll have two choices. The first option is denial. You will have to repress the conclusion you have reached because the result of your experiment will conflict with your beliefs, that is, your ideas about the world and the situation you are in. Denial is a psychological defense mechanism of your psyche to protect you from suffering. Denial is the equivalent of the blue pill in the movie The Matrix. You reject the conclusions and reality you have experienced in favor of your beliefs. You return to a fantasy world in which you feel pleasant and safe. To make the repression process complete, your mind will come up with a story. Why did it happen the way it did? This story is a rationalization, that is, a seemingly rational cause that sounds good at first glance and can be accepted as an explanation. Such rationalization simultaneously takes the responsibility for what happened off your shoulders so that you can feel better about yourself, because you can't blame yourself. That is, lower your self-esteem for something you had no control over. Everything will then be fine until the next same situation. But then there is a chance that your fanciful belief will once again be tested by reality and that you will get the same result as before. In displacement and rationalization, you will seemingly be helped by many people tossing out excuses that are very convenient for you to grab onto and sound very plausible at first glance. For example, if you are betrayed by a loved one, you will hear that it was a bad woman, implicitly saying that it was just an exception and you were unlucky, but next time will be better. Or when such a person close to your heart repeatedly hurts you and you have a strange feeling that he or she does it on purpose, because he or she tells you various things that you know did not happen but make you feel worse about yourself. It is your self-esteem that falls when you notice the same behavior in her and bring it to her attention. With the same arguments you heard at your address, then it is different and you should be ashamed because you do not understand her. You may then tend to explain to her that she was tired, that she had a hard day. Maybe she did, but 10 times in a row. This is not a normal situation or coincidence. Rationalization is great if you want to live in sweet ignorance and deceive yourself. I didn't want to. I encourage you to learn more about this mechanism. Useful for understanding the minimum I just presented. As an aside, I will only add that women have a very high degree of ease in using the mechanism of denial, as you will find out a limitless number of times. Very often they also do it unconsciously. I have seen the following scene many times. During a conversation, I said something that was not to my interlocutor's liking. He quoted it with eloquent silence. He ignored it, not referring to what I said in any way. Sometimes you could only see an emotional reaction in the eyes of such a person. Sometimes it was discomfort, and sometimes it was a sassy smile. Mostly, however, it was averted so that I would by no means pursue the subject. The second option is if your experience differs from your perceptions. This is acceptance. Acceptance does not mean that you accept this state of affairs, but it means that you accept reality as it is, as you experienced it, not as you thought it was. Acceptance simply means that you acknowledge reality and don't try to deny it or bury your head in the sand. Acceptance is definitely a more difficult path, especially if you have become emotionally attached to such a thing or concept. The greater the emotional involvement, the more you will tend to deny it. That's because more emotional involvement means more disappointment, and more disappointment means more suffering. And your mind is trying to protect you, so it will repress. Of course, if you decide to consciously repress something, you have the right to do so. I'm just pointing out the consequences that inevitably come with both choices. Acceptance is also difficult for the reason that it requires thinking, and these days are not conducive to thinking. For one thing, there is no time for it. The flood of different stimuli causes the mind to become overloaded by the information or stimulation it receives. This means that if you haven't learned to slow down and think, it's not natural for you to cut yourself off from the various stimuli, TV, internet, other people, and focus your attention on one thing and analyze it yourself. We are used to getting information on a platter. Just type in Google and there it is. But don't forget that someone who presents you with information could simply be wrong in their assessment, or worse, could have an interest in preventing you from learning the truth because they will gain something from it. I explained the conflict of interest in the previous episode, and the second is more dangerous in my opinion, because the conclusions to which acceptance leads can be very painful at first. In such a situation, we already know that the mind, while wanting to protect us, will simultaneously sabotage us, increasing the chances of repressing unpleasant truths. For example, if you have a person who you considered your friend for many years, but in a moment of trial this person turned away from you and did not help you without a clear and sensible reason, you may come to the conclusion that you wasted how many years on such an acquaintance. And an interesting matter, so you may tend to make excuses for your friend, that is, to suppress the facts in this case, not to help in an important matter, and for a while you will be relieved if you give such a person a second chance. It is even more likely than the first time that you will experience at least disappointment a second time. It already happened once, so why should it be different now? What if you thought about it and came to the conclusion that this is not how a friend behaved and accepted the fact that the friendship did not stand the test? Then you are a winner because first of all you will get rid of from your surroundings a person you can't count on. And secondly, you have a chance to give way for the future to people who are only there for you when it is in their interest. But when the situation already requires involvement on their part and doing something for you, incurring some costs, then somehow you strangely find 1,000 excuses why they can't help you. Of course, they would love to, but it just worked out that way. The key here is the role of awareness. If you are aware of the world around you and your own reactions, it will be harder to manipulate or control you. Acceptance leads to two main things. First, you start to live a little more pleasantly because you stop suffering. If you truly accept something, you then stop catapulting yourself into various unpleasant thoughts like what if, or what could you have done better. Secondly, and more importantly, you begin to grow because most often, to accept something, you will need to understand the mechanisms that caused it for very mundane reasons, to protect yourself from suffering in the future. The name of this channel is What You Need to Know. When you decide to accept something you don't understand, you will want to know yourself. You will start looking for information and answers about the world around you, and that's what development is. Once you decide to consciously accept something, then it becomes inevitable to observe reality and draw your own conclusions. If once you had a false idea about the world, or worse, It turns out that someone presented you with a false vision of reality without judging whether intentionally or not, then it's possible that your other beliefs are also false. The unpleasant fact is that great suffering is often required for awakening. Only this most often motivates a person to change. That's why it's said that to bounce back, you have to reach the bottom. When you begin to accept reality, you will find that there are very many areas where you will come to the conclusion that what you have been told and what you observe are two completely different things. Then you have a chance to understand a lot of things, such as the female-male game that no one told you about before. This was the path I also traveled. Only suffering forced me to accept reality, and it was not easy or pleasant. If you are not interested in development, including spiritual development, to reduce suffering, all you need to do is to let your mind suppress reality. Just know that this is a half measure because it does not solve the real problem. True peace of mind requires you to walk a harder and longer path and accept reality. There is nothing free in life. You will come to pay the price for this realization. But this price turns out to be low compared to living with false beliefs. It is better for you to know, that is, to be aware, because if you are not aware, most of the time your behavior will be guided by the subconscious. Consciousness makes you have a choice. The fact that you have a choice means that you are not forced into only one behavior. To some of you, consciousness may sound like some esoteric gibberish, but that's irrelevant. It exists and is part of every human being and plays a huge role. When you were a few years old and learning to ride a bicycle, you probably didn't know what gravity was, but the effects of this force are felt when you fall. The same is true of consciousness and subconsciousness. Whether you know about it or not, it is there and works to your advantage or disadvantage.